Hi, everybody. Kathy here from Laying Groundwork. Hope everyone is doing well today. So, our topic for today is this whole idea of mastering your inner voice. So, I'm going to make the bold assumption that all of us have patterns of thinking that are not really very helpful. So, you can call these toxic thinking. I kind of like to call them stinking thinking. So, this is this idea that we have kind of almost pre-programmed responses to events in our lives based on past circumstances, past ideas, past things that we have learned from experience that kind of color the rest of how we look at things, the circumstances, the events that happen in our lives. Some of these are really, really helpful, absolutely. Many of them are not. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at stinkin' thinking. Okay. So, the way that we're going to look at this is to recognize that many times these are patterns that have been in place for such a long time that we don't even consciously necessarily recognize when we have one, when one of them surfaces in response to a circumstance or event in our lives. Okay. So I've chosen three really basic ones. There are lots and lots of these. And so this is just kind of an introduction to the idea. Okay, so it's not a complete overview by any stretch of the imagination. So the first one that we want to talk about is this idea of overgeneralization. So this is when we might take something that is happening or that has happened in our lives and we turn it into this never-ending saga that continues to play out throughout the rest of our experiences, right? So again, these can be absolutely based on a true experience that we might have had, but we're taking the emotion of it and we're putting it into a context that it doesn't necessarily always belong. So an example of this might be when you notice yourself using language like always, never. So it might be like, this always happens to me. I'm never gonna, fill in the blank, whatever it is. So it's like literally taking something that happened in the past, putting it into the present, and then expanding it out into future expectations of things that we can and cannot do, what we can and cannot expect, for example. Okay. Black and white thinking can be really, really tricky because it's really very rigid. So it's being on one side or the other side, and it's not, of course, inappropriate to have an opinion. It is, however, it can be a little tricky when you get so attached to the idea that you cannot expand into thinking about that particular topic in a different way. Okay. So it's very rigid. It's either this or it's this. And you can kind of see where that might set us up for divisiveness in our day-to-day lives. The next one is my personal favorite, and this is one I'm really good at personally, is this idea of filtering. So this is when we have something that we believe that we literally look for evidence to support that, and we dismiss anything that challenges that evidence. Okay, so here's an example that one of my teachers used many, many years ago. If you can kind of imagine that here's a young woman, for example, who believes that all men are jerks. They're just jerks. And she's had a lot of difficult experiences with relationships with men in her past. So there's validity, there's truth that started this way of thinking. However, what she has maybe done is she's coloring everybody with that same brush, right? So what it might look like is that she could be in a room with 100 guys. 99 of them are really, really good, nice guys, and she will find the one jerk in the room. So it's again, it's us looking at our experiences, taking a judgment, making a belief out of it, and then, coloring every other experience that's related to that with that same brush. Okay. So we can begin to learn to challenge these toxic thinking patterns. Take some practice. I'm not going to lie, it's not easy. Take some practice, but it is something that we can do. Okay. So, for example, one of the things that you might have to start with is recognizing when you're doing it. When do you find yourself falling into a pattern of stinking thinking or toxic thought patterns? When are you doing that? And then once you learn to catch yourself, then what you can start to do is to begin to separate out the circumstance, the actual facts of the event from the emotion that is around it. So remember, part of why these things are as sticky as they are is because we have an emotional charge around it. There's a story, there's a narrative around the event that perhaps started this whole series of dominoes, right? So what we want to do is we want to identify, okay, so what actually happened here? If I take the narrative out, if I take the emotional charge and the story out of it, why it supports how I feel about, see, I told you I was right. We take all of that stuff out of it and just look at the facts, right? Then we can start to recognize that we might have an emotional charge around events that are or circumstances that are kind of in this category. From that point, we can take a look at if were to gauge my emotional response or interpretation here, where is it? If I put it on a scale of 0 to 10, right? 0 being little to none and 10 being the lid blew off, where am I with this? And just kind of do your best to give it a number, just to kind of give yourself a place to start. And then take a look at the thought. So what did you think? Did you say this always happens this way? This person doesn't understand me. What is the thought that you had? And then if you can, as close as you can, identify what is the thinking pattern that thought falls into, whatever it is, right? And then because now you have the thought, you've had the thinking pattern, for example, that you might be filtering, you might be overgeneralizing, whatever it is, and you have the emotional response over here that might be at a 7 or 8 or 9 or even 10, right? So we've been able to separate those things out. Then you have the ability to be able to say, okay, so what is the evidence that really does this always happen? Has this never happened? What is actually the evidence? Have you really never met a nice guy? So what is the the evidence that supports this way of thinking? And just really, really as clear as you can with yourself about that. And then you have the opportunity to say, okay, so is this is this a true thought or is it a habit of thinking? Where is this, right? So once we can kind of start to recognize that this might just be a toxic thinking pattern, from that space with the emotion and this narrative and the story removed from it, we might find ourselves in a better space to be able to generate another way of thinking about this circumstance or situation. Okay. So once you're able to do that, then you can go back and just say, okay, now where is my emotional charge around this? And just see if it has dropped. It might stay the same, but for a lot of us, I think we find that level of emotional charge has dropped just as a result of finding a different pattern, to be able to start at least a different pattern of thinking around the events. Okay. So I hope you found this useful, and I think that when we realize that most of us have a lot of these kinds of thinking patterns going on, I think it can be really, really useful to start to challenge them. And so I would really appreciate it if you find this useful, if you find this helpful, if you could like and subscribe to my channel. We'll be dropping content really regularly. And please keep in mind that I always offer a free discovery session if you are interested in having some one-on-one or even small group coaching available to you. Okay, thanks very much and take good care. Hope to see you again soon.